you so much, and we especially appreciate the Czech Embassy hosting this event. And it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished panelists. But first, a quick word about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So we were established by an authorizing act of Congress in 1993 to educate Americans about the ideology, the history, and the legacy of communism, to remember the victims of communist regimes around the world, some 100 million people killed in some 40 national experiences of communism in the last 100 years. This year, of course, is not only the 40th anniversary of the Charter 77 movement, but also the 100th year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which gave the world its first real-life experience of Marx's ideals. So today, in the last 3 years, I would say, we have ramped up our activities significantly at VOC, and there are a couple of reasons for that, at least three, actually. One is that many of those who can tell the stories, especially of communism in Europe and the former Soviet Union, are passing away. They're dying, and their stories are dying with them. And so one of the projects that we have launched is called Witness, which is an attempt to tell some of those stories. We certainly cannot capture them all, but to tell some of those stories in a way that can connect with young Americans who find it very difficult to understand what life was like behind the Iron Curtain. Another reason is that many of those young people who are one of our primary audiences are ignorant about the realities of communist rule. And unfortunately, it is a failure of our education system that there is a kind of double standard, whereas the crimes of the Holocaust are well known, and rightly so, as being the murder of millions of Jewish people and a unique act. Many people are not aware, under the age of 35, of the devastating toll on humanity that communist regimes brought to the world. And so it is our mission to educate these people. And that is because of a third reason why we have had to do more in the last 3 years. And that is because of a doubling down on ideology and totalitarian tactics by the world's 5 remaining communist regimes. And some 20% of the world's population today lives in one of those still single-party Leninist states. Outside the borders of those countries, we see a growth not only in actual communist parties and their electoral success around the world, but countries like Venezuela, who are now closer to communism than they've ever been, with the passage a few months ago of a law in Venezuela attempting to remedy the food shortages there that allows the state to take citizens out of the cities and force them to work on farms in the countryside. Many of you will recognize that as a form of collectivized farming. So for all of these reasons, what we do here is very important, and our exploration of this history of Charter 77 is especially important. Charter 77 was a watershed moment in the Eastern Bloc. It was a demand that the authorities in Czechoslovakia hold to the commitments and the guarantees that they had agreed to in Helsinki Accords, and by an extension, an indictment of the Soviet Union, who very often spoke one thing and did another when it came to human rights. And many of those who signed Charter 77 would, of course, go on to be some of the leading politicians and cultural figures that made the Velvet Revolution in 1989 possible. And of course, it was a movement that attempted to rebuild civil society. And of all the things that communist regimes destroyed, certainly one of the most difficult to rebuild is civil society and the trust that that depends on. So we're very happy today to co-sponsor this event, a series of events today. You'll see on the back of your program that we'll have a couple more events this afternoon at Georgetown University, and some of you may wish to join us there. So now let me go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists today, and the first is Ambassador Martin Coolidge. He was a signatory of Charter 77 and a founding member of the Civic Platform. He was appointed the Czech ambassador to the United States and served in that post from 2001 to 2005. He was later named the Czech Republic's permanent representative to the United Nations. He is currently director of the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at Florida International University, and a member of the Prague Society for International Cooperation. To his left, we have Marianne Cannavaro Silveriano. She is a professor of French at the French Lycée in Washington, D.C. She has taught French to President Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, and to his brother Ivan, and as it's written here, to Martin Wolsztyn himself. In the 1980s, she worked at a French secondary school in Prague, and used that post to translate key Czech works into French, and also to serve as a sort of post for Czech dissidents and for Czech exiles, and a node in that nation, the civil society. To her left, we have Dr. James Pantuso. He is the Charles Patterson Professor of Government and Foreign Affairs at Hampton-Sydney College. He's authored and edited 7 books and published more than 90 articles, reviews, and essays, including Václav Havel, Civic Responsibility in the Postmodern Age, and Assault on Ideology, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Political Thought. Finally, we have Dr. Flagg Taylor. He's an associate professor of government at Skidmore College. Dr. Taylor specializes in the history of political thought and American government, and he has edited a very important collection. It is entitled The Long Night of the Watchman, Essays by Václav Benda, 1977 to 1989, and that is forthcoming in March of 2017. But he's also edited a collection of essays, Czech dissidents, published by ISI Press, and maybe he can mention the title of that book. Following their remarks, we will open it up for questions and conversation with the audience. If you don't mind, you all have a note card on your chair. If you could write your question on that and pass it up to our friend here, yes. We will do our best to incorporate many of those into our conversation today. And with that, I turn it over to Ambassador Coolidge.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, organizers, for putting this together. It's a very good to remember Charter 77 in our days. And I would have to say right away, I feel a little bit strange and in a kind of Havelian absurd situation. On the one hand, being an object in a museum that you are to observe, because this is 40 years ago. At the same time, to be a guide through this museum now, and maybe to defend my imperfections of these days, and listen to experts that are going to come up with their ideas concerning our ideas, and maybe my ideas too, and disagreeing with my ideas, listening to them. So, with this warning, my remarks. Certainly, what we are discussing today is for me not just a theme for study, but personal affair. Charter 77, and take it as an important message, is a part of my life. If I want to mention just 3 years important, 1968, 1977, and 1989. They are not only certainly important for my life, but they are making the history of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic in the second half of the 20th century. Mr. Beranek, chargé d'affaires, mentioned that Charter 77 was maybe the least visible year in this situation. I don't want to argue this point, but I understand it was, I would say, something that happened, I would say, in the middle of night, in the middle of darkness, maybe small light, a small candle, but nothing more than that. But let's start from 68. I have 15 minutes, so I need to go very quickly forward. But 68 was, for us, I was 17 and a half years old. It was a glimmer of hope. It was not for me a debate about possibilities of socialism with human face, as some people seem to believe, but it was a hope. And then all of a sudden, from this hope back to the abyss, to the normalization time of 1970s. I don't know whether you can imagine that, what normalization of this style was. But it was basically to push you into certain options, certain decisions. I don't want to, I cannot go here into details to discuss communist ideology. But I keep saying always that it's not only communist ideology and its changes in the course of time, but reaction of people to it. What matters and what should be observed. Because there were three options. Either smallest, maybe clearest option was, I can't stand that, I need to go out. So hundreds of thousands of people emigrated from Czechoslovakia. The most of people didn't want to do that for obvious reasons, couldn't do that for obvious reasons, and so they decided to coordinate themselves with the situation. And the capacity of coordination of European peoples in the 20th century is unlimited. Ask Germans, what do they think about their past? And I can go on and on. And I don't want to blame those who coordinated themselves with the situation, because they might have very good reasons. Their families, good causes they were still fighting for. The 70s was not the end of the day, but still it was something that really pushed you to the limits as far as your personal identity. Read the Havel's letter to Dr. Hussar in 1975, when he was just describing exactly these feelings. And it was already obvious that what he, and I can say we, were searching was some sort of third option. Can you live in this situation and be more loyal to yourself, to feel that you do things you are identified with? And I think this was the beginning of Charter 77. Charter 77 was resistance, but it was not, I would say, resistance with specific political goals to overthrow regime and replace it with something else. It was resistance on this moral, existential level, if you want to say. If there are some philosophers here, not many philosophers in these days in human societies, but anyways, this is a typical, I think Socrates would be the principal inspirator of these type of actions. Professor Patočka was one of the first spokespersons of Charter 77, articulated this position very clearly and very eloquently, and he put Charter 77 into his philosophical concept and gave Charter 77 certain, I would say, flavor, dynamism, and energy, which was based on that. For scholars to study the relationship between Patočka and Havel in the context of philosophy is an interesting thing. But what was more important, and maybe this was the greatest surprise, was what happened when people like me or some others decided to sign and join. Because you can ask each of them, what was your motivation? Why did you do that? And you would get some answers, but I guess that a personal problem, identity would be the common denominator of all of that. But the fact is that you didn't do that alone. You did that with other people. There were some others, and you started to create relationships with them, and this was actually a very surprising thing. Charter 77 was an adventure. I will tell you right away, when you signed that, you couldn't predict what would be the consequences of that deed. It was unimaginable for us to believe that the system could collapse, that we would be out of sudden turned into maybe revolutionary politicians, if you want, of 1989. 1977 was certainly hope beyond hope, just to use the words of Armando Guerra, as Cuban dissident, who spent ages in jail. It was a hope that it makes sense to do things no matter what the result is. Václav Havel wrote that somewhere that hope is not to believe that things turn well, but hope is to do things if you are convinced they are good things, no matter what. So this no matter what was Charter 77, and we started, I would say, to live together. Living together certainly had some, I would say, political meaning, and you can go to both directions. Internationally, it was mentioned, it was the Helsinki process in its context, and Charter 77 experiment, if you want, was observed by the world. And we are, I would say, grateful today to people like Marianne and others who were in that situation with us, who took note of what was going on, who helped us in many, many ways. Just being there and sharing their stories with ours, or eventually being messengers between us, because we are still living beyond the Army curtain, and so on and so forth. Again, I cannot go into details, but it's a pity that this history has not been written yet. As far as I know, there is a non-consistent history of Charter 77. It's 40 years now, and there are so many questions, so many facts that would need to be preserved for the future uses. And then I think Frank is going to talk about that, parallel police. This was Charter 77 is traditionally connected with the human rights struggles. We wanted to have a dialogue about human rights with the government. Such a dialogue never took place, obviously, because the government was not ready for anything like that for obvious reasons. But this dialogue had a very significant implication for communications dialogues among us, and among us and people in the world. What was happening in these 13 years were so many things. There was a generation of spokespersons for Charter 77, one year after another. In each year, tens of documents of Charter 77 were published, describing things that were relevant in the society. And I'm now going to use this concept because I think that this is one of the legacies of Charter 77. We were fighting with alternative facts, with alternative realities, with the realities that were just constructed on, based on some ideological presumptive beliefs and opinions, and maybe not touching up with the heart of reality. Charter 77 had this power, the power of the powerless, maybe not to compete for power, but to re-establish contacts with reality. And who is not experienced living in a totalitarian system, maybe cannot appreciate enough this basic thing, re-establishment of your touch connection with realities and keeping your common sense and I would say morality in at least a state of reasonable health under these circumstances. So Charter 77 was for me a great adventure. It was a great inspiration. It's still, I would say, sea of stories and things that have not been explored properly. And I think that maybe this is 40 years, it's a long time. So what we are doing today is a reminder that it is time to do something about that. Because it seems to me that we are living again in the world where we might have a problem to convince ourselves that the search for truth makes sense. That everybody likes to sell her narratives and support them with alternative facts. I don't want to blame these people for that. I don't want to say that these alternative facts are eventually not facts. But there are some other facts too. And the best thing what we can do is to listen to other people with other facts. Chapter 77 was a great example that people having different beliefs, opinions, just wording the text, the original declaration of chapter 77, but I can go on and on, be together, overcome their differences, and keep the hope that things can get better at some point in the future. Thank you.
It is an honor for me to testify to my Charter 77 experience, and I am grateful to Martin Parosh for inviting me today. I was a marginal witness and player in this period. However, these Czech years greatly influenced not only my political vision of the world, but also my vision of human nature. Discovering Charter 77 was an existential shock. In 1980, I was studying languages at university. I grew up in a family that was involved in the resistance during the Second World War, a family committed to progressive values such as freedom, social justice, and atheism. I felt privileged to have grown up in a democracy with leftist values. Obviously, I didn't think I would have anything to learn from this country in this matter. When I arrived in Czechoslovakia on a linguistic scholarship, I had no illusions about the nature of the regime. Immediately, reality took on the caricatured features of real socialism. My university residence in Brno, situated on Lenin Avenue, was suggestively called Friendship, and Czech teachers recommended we greet them with an enthusiastic honor to work, a formula in vogue in the early days of Czechoslovakian communism. Fortunately, one of my classmates knew the address of one charter signatory supported by Amnesty International, and we paid him a visit. Josef Adamek was a Catholic printer who lived as an authentic Christian, totally committed to his faith, who truly loved his neighbor. This was my first shock. Faith wasn't necessarily the opium of the people. Joseph gave me contacts in Prague. Then I discovered the Prague intellectual environment of the opposition and Martin Parosh. I was also struck by both the determination of these individuals and their ability to ignore danger. It took me time to understand the exact causes of my upheaval when discovering this society isolated in a communist slump. But I clearly knew that what was at stake here was a political and human experience that was not happening in the West, and I wanted to be part of it. Since then, I had one goal: move to Prague and do my part. Back in France, I immediately wanted to make myself useful. I started to translate censored releases and books. I started to frequent Pavel and Ivana Tigrin, the main leaders of the Czech opposition in exile. Thanks to them, I found myself involved in a suitcase carrier between Paris and Prague. The maneuver consisted in carrying back containing books or a photocopy machine. In the 1980s, photocopiers were compact enough to be carried and go unnoticed in the luggage rack of a rail car. Carriers would drop the bag in a different rail car, ignore it, especially during border inspections, pick up it upon arrival in Prague, and deliver it to charter's acquaintance. Concerning police supervision, I am still very skeptical about what the police knew or did not know. I have been so lucky that I came to wonder if it wasn't all orchestrated by the police for reasons I still struggle to explain. There were several of us implementing these deliveries. Soon enough, however, some of them lost their visa for Prague. A friend was arrested at the border in a pickup truck loaded with prohibited publications, which led to a big anti-charter campaign. Another friend was controlled in a cafe with friends of the charter and never obtained a visa again. I was also present that night, but the police ID check took place while I was in the bathroom. Yet another uncanny coincidence. During this period, where I was making frequent trips between Paris and Prague, I conveyed all sorts of oral messages. This allowed for secured exchanges, because remote communication was almost impossible. Mail and telephone communication was continuously scrutinized. Besides, I remember transmitting discussion about how to detect microphones. Much later, I transmitted a similar discussion about a technological innovation which seemed to be science fiction, the fax. In any case, the only technique that allowed relative serenity was direct contact. During this period, I hung out with boys my own age. We used to exchange letters very often. They lived in the countryside and often came to the capital to meet other young people and acquire music tapes and samizdat books. I remember shipping to them all of Frank Zappa's records. He was a real idol. Later, Václav Havel nominated him Special Ambassador to the West on trade, culture, and tourism. These boys were practicing Catholics who wore long hair and were fans of rock music, all of them workers, all of them hungry for culture. The spacious apartment of the Chartists very often turned into giant dorms where we spent entire nights discussing. In hindsight, their privacy was reduced to a minimum. It was a real commitment. There was also my very close friend, Alena Kuprechtova, employed as a night watch in a hotel, who sometimes translated books or articles from English into Czech. Like all signatories of the Charter, she was harassed by police. Interrogations and searches at home were frequent. One day, she looked high and low for a tape she had hidden in anticipation of a search. She finally found it months later in her freezer. I mentioned this episode to underline that, like many others, she considered this marginalized and complicated life with a certain lightness. There were not only dark and scary moments, there were also moments of frank hilarity, as when she realized that the tape had become inaudible. I remained close to the first dissident I met during my first stay in Brno. Each time I saw him, he used to give me a little prayer written with a typewriter. We'd meet in public places, and it was always funny, because he was a little deaf and used to speak very loud, even when transmitting confidential information. Besides courage and integrity, which dissidents demonstrated daily, this humor was one of the things that seemed to me the most extraordinary. It reminds me of another funny anecdote of a friend, Ivana Hiblerova. She went to interrogation wearing a hat, based on the belief that it would be more difficult to slap a woman wearing a hat than one without. I also remember this phrase, which had circulated among the charter members, and that they used to answer the political police. I understand the words separately, but the overall sense of your questions escapes me. As I went along, I met more friends, priests and pastors forbidden to worship, people from the left, close to the reformist communism of Prague Spring, people from the right, supporting Reagan or Thatcher, even royalists. And all these people who would have ripped each other to shreds in a democratic country could set their dissension aside to campaign together. Without any doubt, enabling a platform on civic and human rights, regardless of political or religious differences, was a stroke of genius that the Charter provided. It is also one of the things that has utterly impressed me, not to mention the extreme social diversity of this environment, where leading intellectuals discussed with workers much less versed in theoretical thinking, and where all generations met on equal terms. It was a completely open micro-society within a completely closed society. Before any significant political change, it was already in itself a stunning success. 3 years after my first stay in Prague, I contracted a marriage of convenience which allowed me to stay. Once established in Prague, the scope of my acquaintance and activities widened. I had the opportunity to get to know people as different as Petr Ur, a Trotskyist imprisoned several times for a total of 9 years, and future head of the Czech National Press Agency, Václav Malin, a priest forbidden to worship, and the future Bishop of Prague, Martin Palouši's friends, philosophers and thinkers, among whom were Havel's brothers. By the way, as you all know, it happened that Martin became the Czech Republic ambassador to the United States prior to taking office as a permanent representative to the United Nations for the Czech Republic. I also met Václav Havel after his release from prison. At that time, he was already immensely popular in Czechoslovakia, outside the opposition circles. I was surprised to meet a man who was not diminished by his years in prison and had immediately resumed the fight. He had a great sense of humor too. We were honored to feature his editorial in the first edition of our satirical Samizdat review, the organ of the Czech branch of Sock Lovers. He was not stranger either to my subsequent expulsion, but I will I will talk of this later. Today, I don't exactly know in what circumstances we decided to organize a French language course, but for a few years, it was a pretext for weekly meetings with Martin, Ivan Havel, Anna Shabatova, and a few others. My language skills were more helpful when acting as an interpreter for French journalists or for the French embassy, when it came to arranging delicate meetings with the opposition. I also served as an interpreter at Ladislav Hejdanek's seminary, a philosopher who often received leading French philosophers. These conferences were clandestine and occurred most often in Ladislav Hejdanek's apartment in front of a small audience. Obviously, these activities had not escaped the political police, and I had been, right before settling in Prague, subject to police surveillance. First, the police followed me closely, since after the revolution, I learned that my first Czech boyfriend was a STB, State Security Informant. I had no reason to have any suspicion about him. He was a perfect marginal guy, long-haired, an intellectual confined to outranked employed, who was living very modestly. From time to time, I happened to notice very ostensible tailing. The first time, I felt very disturbed, and I did everything I could to escape, but I was unarmed to face the number, and finally, these were only attempts to intimidate me that didn't lead to anything concrete. Little by little, it seemed less scary, and sometimes even funny. One day, my friend Anna Shabatova had a very important meeting in a foreign embassy and desperately wanted to get there, but she was afraid to be stopped because she was under close surveillance. I offered to let her come to my home. There was an inner courtyard shared with other buildings, which would enable her to live by another street. My friend took off through the inner courtyard. The next morning, the police were still waiting before my building and were furious, which was Anna's sweet revenge. But there were also less enjoyable episodes. For example, when the political police called the owners of my apartment in for questioning. They were given a simple choice: either kick me out or lose their authorization to travel abroad. As a result, I had to stay with the dissident who had already nothing to lose. I also had to undergo questioning at the premises by the political police because of a confiscated letter at the border crossing. It resembled a B-movie. The bad cop shouted and seemed ready to explode with rage and hit me. The good guy was looking for reconciliation. The questions were totally insignificant, but I could well enough imagine that things could go wrong, and I was scared. My last experience with the police is related to my expulsion, or more precisely to the non-renewal of my visa. I already said that Václav Havel was unintentionally linked to this. Here is how. I had a conflict with the first secretary of the French embassy. One of my closest friends, Peter Hull, decided to write to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to support my cause. To give more weight to this letter, he had asked Václav Havel to co-sign for her. So they exchanged drafts, and it happened that one of the drafts was seized during a house search. So I was forced to leave Czechoslovakia without any appeal. But we were already in 1988, the authority of the regime was on the decline, and it was possible for the French government to negotiate my return on the occasion of a state visit by President Mitterrand. This is how I became the first foreigner expelled for political reasons to return before the November 1989 Velvet Revolution. Last but not the least, in 1990, when Václav Havel made his first state visit to France as president of the new Czechoslovakia, I was his interpreter. In retrospect, I realized that all these remarkable people got the reward they deserved. Also, I have never had the privilege of meeting her. I cannot conclude without mentioning another remarkable person of Czech origin. I mean Madeleine Albright, born Korbelova, the first woman to become the United States Secretary of State. Just a few days ago, she issued a tweet which said, 40 years ago, charter leaders petitioned for human rights in Czechoslovakia. Today, we must summon their courage and defend democracy worldwide. As we say in French, ce n'est qu'un début, continuons le combat. It's only the beginning, carry on.
To Prague 6 years ago to begin conducting interviews with signatories of Charter 77 and other individuals related to the Charter movement. I was lucky enough to meet a woman named Kamila Bendova, who is the wife of the late Václav Benda. I remember going up in the elevator to her flat and absolutely shaking with excitement, knowing that I was going to enter the flat where many, many meetings of charter signatories took place, sitting in the same chairs that probably these people had sat in, and just being awed by the prospect of talking to a woman who had been so central to the movement. Just want to begin with a little anecdote, just to tell you a little bit about the courage of someone like Kamila Bendova. Kamila has a degree in mathematics from Charles University and had a job working at the Czech Academy of Sciences. By the time Václav signed the charter, they had 5 children. Their flat was known to be a place where anyone who was in trouble with the regime could go to seek help. They were conduits for Samizdat underground literature, just a place that was central to the movement in general. And so I asked Kamila, I said, how possibly did you manage all of this when your husband was in prison for 4 years? And what was it like when he got out of prison? Did you think about perhaps stepping back, retreating, and maybe letting some other people take center stage and being happy and just trying to be a family again? And she looked at me and said, well, we did have a welcoming party for Václav when he returned from prison. Maybe, Martin, you were probably there. And I said, well, what did you say to him when he walked in? And she said, well, the first thing that happened was that he was given a petition that immediately required his signature protesting the imprisonment of some dissident or something or other. And then I said, well, what else did you talk about? What did you say to him? And she said, well, I told him that he must immediately resume his position as charter spokesperson so that the regime would know that your imprisonment had no effect on you. then that I just wanted to tell these people stories and learn more about them. I'm going to talk about the grand strategy of Charter 77. And I don't mean that this was necessarily a self-conscious strategy from the beginning, that this was something that they designed in theory and then implemented, but what I'm trying to do is delineate a strategy as it emerged from the practice of the dissidents. And I suspect that these elements of the strategy might have lessons for people who will resist tyrannies presently and in the future. So the first element of their strategy I call law and publicity, visibility restored. Here the idea is pretty simple. It's that a polity has to have some means of seeing itself and expressing a judgment about what it sees. Of course, we take this for granted in free regimes, but this is precisely what totalitarian regimes are so good at erasing. And so Charter 77 announced to the regime that it would take into account its actions and call the regime to account for disobeying its own laws, right? And this was possible because of the signature of the Helsinki Accords and these human rights conventions being incorporated into Czechoslovak law. The other element of the strategy is publicity, and this was an important element because in the 1950s, under the sort of Stalinist phase of the communist regime, it was very easy for people to disappear without a trace, right? Someone could be arrested and sent to the labor camps to work in uranium mines and never be heard from again. But a sister organization called VONS, which is the acronym for the Committee to Defend the Unjustly Persecuted, was developed about a year after the initial charter movement. And VONS made it impossible for people to disappear without a trace. Charter signatories and VONS members would make sure that they attended the trials of those who were persecuted. They got word out about these individuals to Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. They communicated as widely as possible to a wide circle as possible about the fate of these particular people. So they publicized the fate of these unfortunate individuals persecuted by the regime. And so that element of insisting on the rule of law and creating a kind of public opinion that the regime would know was ready to announce and judge their actions was a crucial element of the charter strategy. The second element of the strategy I call truth in word and deed. This is perhaps the most well-known part of the strategy, and the intent was a kind of remoralization. Martin already alluded to this element of the strategy. The charter encouraged people to purge themselves of ideological thinking and behavior, insofar as that behavior manifested itself in everyday compromises. And of course, the core text here is Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless essay, although you can see it in other elements of other essays as well. And Havel's idea was pretty straightforward. He argued that the perpetuation of communist tyranny depended upon everyone repeating these ideological slogans. It depended upon them attending these May Day parades, voting in these meaningless elections, hanging the correct flags outside your flat on national holidays. The Soviet flag was required, of course. And Havel says nobody actually had to believe in these actions or believe in these slogans, but they have to behave as if they did. And so Havel announced that here's the great paradox of communist tyranny. It's precisely, its strength lies precisely in its ability to implicate everyone into the maintenance of its own power. But Havel said, this also means that everyone has more power than they think they do. Because if everyone stops participating in these seemingly minor actions, for example, Havel says, the greengrocer who puts the sign, "Workers of the world unite" in his window, right? If you stop doing that, these little pebbles can make a big splash. And of course, the downside to the strategy is the regime made minor actions like this quite costly. the loss of one's job. You could find yourself working as a stoker in the basement of a building when you were a scientist or something like this. And so people are likely to accept the bargain of doing what's expected of them in exchange for being just left alone. And for Havel, the willingness of people to be satisfied with just being quote-unquote left alone was evidence of a profound moral crisis in the society. And so he and his mentor, Jan Patočka, encouraged people to rid themselves of this ideological thinking, to live in truth, as Havel put it, and to refuse to live within the lie. And it's only then, Patočka and Havel argued, that one could recapture your identity and your responsibility in a profound way. Finally, the third prong of the charter strategy I call citizenship and fraternity, or repoliticization. This third strategy is perhaps the least well known of the elements of the charter, but I think it's particularly important because it confronts the weaknesses and the limits of the first two elements of the strategy. The fact is that the initial response of the regime to the charter movement was fairly successful in isolating that movement from the larger population, rendering a judgment on the regime by signing a petition or by protesting the imprisonment of someone who is merely circulating underground literature, or by meeting with a Western visitor carried real costs. The regime increased the cost of joining as a signatory or merely being associated with members. A mere casual conversation with someone associated with the charter could lead to an interview with the STB. More than one signatory told me that she would even avoid eye contact with friends on the street for fear of causing those friends unnecessary entanglements with the regime. And so the strategy of the charter seemed to have two weaknesses. It was utterly naive insofar as it took the regime's claims about abiding by its own laws at face value, and its genuine and high-minded moral stance, the idea that you should rid yourself of ideological thinking, seemed to some people abstract. Did one really want to risk going to prison or losing one's job by taking a sign down from one's window, right? Would you sacrifice your children's education for that? And so Václav Benda, in a famous essay called The Parallel Polis in 1978, argued that the charter should move in the direction of trying to offer people something quite concrete. And he argued that the regime, or rather the charter, should foster and develop the parallel polis, meaning alternative structures to the regime structures. And so he argued that the charter community should try to foster and protect underground seminars, the underground church, the musical underground, Samizdat literature, things that we think of today as constituting civil society. This is what the charter needed to do, because while some people might not be terribly interested in taking what they thought would be an abstract moral stance, right, against the regime, those same people might well be interested in attending a seminar where people were reading Plato and really trying to understand the meaning of Plato's dialogues and learning from these wonderful teachers that had been forbidden from teaching in Charles University. And so if the charter could reawaken people's longing for participation in these meaningful societal institutions where trust and social solidarity could be reborn, that might offer the average person on the street something concrete, and again would reawaken their longing for freedom in a way that living in truth it might not. It was in these concrete spaces, these seminars, these meetings of the underground church, where communal life was trying to reassert itself. It's in these places where people could go to experience meaningful bonds of trust and affection. It's here where they could truly put things in common and expand the horizon of their concern. Thus, Benda sought to counter a more radical version of what the great French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville termed individualism, right? A disease that we associate with democracy, but a disease which communist tyranny exacerbates to an extent we just haven't seen, I would say, probably in human history. So, law and publicity, truth in word and deed, and citizenship and fraternity. Those are the three elements of the strategy that the Charter, I think, asks us to consider and suggests going forward might be possible ways for future dissidents to confront tyranny in their own countries and their own particular circumstances. Thank you.
I have rather a large voice. I don't think I need a microphone. Okay? You can hear me?
No.
Yeah. My wife complains about it on occasion. The first thing I'd like to say is this. I was in Prague not long after communism fell, and I met a lot of people who were dissidents, talked to them about Charter 77. The first thing I'd like to say is I thought about myself in those conditions, and I don't know whether I would have had the courage to do what they did. There aren't many people who will stand up publicly against law of their country in the way that the Chartists did. I have gone to sleep some nights hoping I would have been that courageous, but I'm really not sure. And so it is a real honor to be here with you. This panel wants to examine the enduring legacy of Charter 77. And as the title implies, for there to be an enduring legacy, it seems to me the brave opposition of Czechs and Slovaks to totalitarianism has to be more than a historical moment. That is, has to be more than just a moment in Czechoslovak history. For Czechs, of course, Charter 77 is extremely important and a symbol of freedom and has enduring significance. But what about the wider audience? That is, what about the reception of Charter around the world? And that is, in a way, led to the title of my talk, which is this, The Dissident Reception, How Charter 77 Won the West, and then rode off into the sunset. So, how was Charter 77 received by the non-communist world, and particularly the United States, of which I know something? Well, its legacy has gone through a number of stages. The first stage I like to call the homeless person period. First, Charter 77 was about ideas. And ideas make terrible television. And in the Western world, most people got, even in the 1970s and 80s, even before the technological boom in information, most got their information, or much of their information, via the television or radio or something like that. And Charter didn't really ever make television, because they met in hall rooms and in apartments in a lot of Hrmatkova's place. And so I thought about that for a while, and I did an extremely unscientific poll, I know, but I did it amongst my colleagues at my college, and a few other colleagues I have at other places. Now, my colleagues are, all PhDs. And I asked them, did you remember Charter 77? Now, they all knew, or very many of them knew, Charter 77 after the collapse of communism. They knew about it. But I asked them, did you remember Charter 77 during the Cold War? And the answer was, surprisingly, I can't remember whether I can remember. Now, what is particularly surprising is one of my colleagues was the American ambassador to UNESCO in the 1970s. And the other, another of my colleagues was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency under Jimmy Carter. So these are not people who weren't engaged in the middle of public affairs. Now, of course, some of us paid attention to the dissidents. I know dissidents don't really like that word, and for good reason, but that's what we call them. We remembered what they were up to, partly because some of us, like me, grew up in the 1960s, and Vietnam sort of created our consciousness, and it was created to be left. And so I flirted with a kind of, I don't know, Marxism. I was a Marxist thinker, I thought. The last day I was ever a Marxist was the day, I can remember thinking myself as a Marxist, was the day before Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. That was the end for me. That was on television. So Americans didn't know much about it, and those of us who did were sort of wondering what we should make of this dissident movement. Europeans, because of their proximity, knew a lot more about what was going on, and if they went there, really took a bold and a brave interest in the events. One need only think of Roger Scruton for a moment. But in the U.S. in particular, those of us who knew about Charter felt helpless. The real struggle, we thought, was between the United States and the Soviet Union. In Henry Kissinger's phrase, the real Cold War for the great powers was over the head of the Europeans. We had enormous sympathy for the dissidents. Who wouldn't? But what could we do? What we thought was, well, we can't risk nuclear war to help them. So we did, I think, what we felt as a report by the United States State Department in 1979 did. I quote, "Prospects for the movement Charter 77 will accomplish its goals are bleak. The regime has all the necessary levers of power and coercion at its disposal and will not hesitate to use them if threatened. It also has no reason for any dialogue with the Chartists because this would open up a Pandora's box. Prague takes its view from Moscow, and Moscow has no interest in talking to dissidents. Despite these bleak prospects, the movement deserves respect and admiration, sympathy for its survival and its willingness to confront the regime." So what do you do about something that's sympathetic? Your heart goes out to it, but you have no clue what to do? Well, the same thing you do with homeless people. Sometimes you just turn your head away and walk by. That's what we did. The second phase I like to call the Orphan Phase. And this has been spoken of. Charter 77's membership was so diverse and so complicated that no one really in the West understood it very well unless they were involved with it. The left, by the time the Chartists had formed, did not trust anti-communism. After Vietnam, the left saw anti-communism as a right-wing paranoia, a throwback to the age of McCarthyism. In some ways, I think the left adopted the famous Doonesbury cartoon motto, "We have met the enemy and he is us." Now, the left was sympathetic to the human rights goals. I mean, I think there was a lot of people on the left who were sympathetic to the human rights goals, but they didn't trust anti-communism. On the other hand, the right was uncomfortable with the counterculture tenor of Charter 77. No respectable right-winger like Frank Zappa. And they certainly didn't like, if they had ever heard, Plastic People of the Universe, for which Václav Havel went to jail. I was at the 30th anniversary of Charter 77. Havel gave his nice talk, and then after the speeches, Charter 77 started to play. We were in the National Museum. And they hit one chord, and I started to run out the door to escape the auditory torture. And I was pushed aside by this little guy who was in front of me. I'm small. He was even smaller. It was Václav Havel. He was trying to get out the door. But that's the point. We in the West just couldn't understand why anybody would go to jail for the Plastic People of the Universe. Very nice people, but man. Also Peter Uhl. I mean, the right did not understand why communists were involved in this movement. They were anti-communist. The right liked Solzhenitsyn, not Havel. And let me tell you, nobody on the political right in that era understood one word of Havel's plays. Not one word. They would read them and they'd go, what is that about? So Charter 77 was a political orphan. The right didn't understand it, and the left didn't know what to make of it, but didn't trust anti-communism. It was hard to have Peter Uhl and Alana Hormakova in the same group. And then, one day, as if by magic, everything changed. Communism started coming apart, and Havel, with his extraordinary gift for staging performances, helped create the most dazzling of revolutions, a velvet one. Now both left and right in the West could claim ownership of the movement. The left thought that it was terrific. It was a human rights organization. Lou Reed's in town. The Rolling Stones are helping light the Harad. The left was in heaven with the movement. And the right was happy too, because it was anti-communist. The very weakness of Charter during the Cold War, its complexity, its diversity, its strange alliances, was now its great strength, because everybody wanted to adopt it. It became the golden child. And boy, was it fantastic living in Prague right after the collapse of communism. Everybody was there. All wings of the Western left and right. But there is one more stage. And that is, the hero rides off into the sunset. Today's college students, my students, were born between 1994 and 1999. They have no understanding of the Cold War. We had a class, a one-credit lecture class last semester on the Cold War, and 100 students showed up. Showed up, and I was there for the first class. We said, why are you in this class? And they're all good kids. So I said, how many of you really are in this class who don't know anything about the Cold War? And every one of the 100 students had heard about the Cold War, but they had no idea what it was about or what was going on. So if they don't know about the Cold War, they're certainly not going to know about Charter 77, because you have to dig down a little bit to get to Charter 77. So in a way, there's another stage. The hero is rode off in the West. But, still means Charter 77's a hero. And I have another story. I went to teach, I like teaching post-tyrannical students. They're great. So I went off to teach in Iraq, in Silveri, Iraq, at the American University of Silveri. I taught there in 2010. And suddenly, I was I should say, after I went to the first Charter 77, a woman named Barbara Falk and I, who's very good on dissident movements, published a little article that went online about Charter 77 in Iran, that maybe the Iranians should, use some of the goals and tactics, building, a parallel polis, and not getting engaged in big, ideological discussions, worrying more about particular things. So this went up online, and I'm teaching in Silveri now, and Silveri, if you know the geography, is right over the hills from Iran. Suddenly, I started to get connections through intermediaries that people wanted to come and talk about philosophy with me, especially Heidegger. What is this? Like everybody in the dissident movement pretends they're talking about Heidegger. Well, the Iranian professors showed up. They want to say a word about Heidegger. They said, yeah, we're going to talk about Heidegger. But what they really wanted to talk about was Charter 77. They wanted to see how the Czechs did it. Because if you live in Iran, you don't want to live under that regime if you have any sense. So what is the enduring significance? And by the way, the discussions, some of them fell through. They couldn't meet me because they were afraid. But we'd meet in crazy places, and we never met in the same place. It was the usual stuff. Even though it was in Kurdistan, northern Iraq, which was safe, they still were worried. I stand out, Kurds don't go gray. So what is the enduring significance of Charter 77? I think here it is. Wherever people are subjugated and kept in line by narrow-minded ideological principles, wherever human beings are trying, wherever the government is trying to find some incredibly difficult or impossible ideology and bring it into the world and bring it into place, brave people will rediscover what Charter 77 did. They will be inspired to stand firm in the name of human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Just fascinating remarks by everyone. Before I give you a few questions from the audience, and I'd ask you to keep it short so we can get your reactions from several different participants here. Do any of you have a quick reaction you would like to give to one of the presentations? Yes?
I have to stand immediately in defense of plastic people. First of all, it's a matter of musical taste, and I respect that. Yes. But read the Patočka's short essay addressed directly to plastic people. Patočka was certainly rather a listener of Beethoven than plastic people, but he, I think, got it, and this is something quite important. And by the way, plastic people's music, the Passion Play of Mapsa was not a long time ago recorded or played by Philharmonic Orchestra to the plastic people of Europe. So in different ways. And just the last thing on this one, remember Stravinsky's premiere of Rites of Spring in Paris in 1913. It was also a big scandal, and no one thought that Stravinsky was a there were many people in the audience who believed that Stravinsky was not a great composer. But more importantly, the story of plastic people universe started Charter 77. And you didn't say that. Because they were sent to jail, or they were to be jailed for their independent creativity. And they were very much followed by what was called underground movement. So Charter 77 came into existence thanks to the plastic people of the universe.
Well, I have no doubt that there's significance. I just wish they played Motown music.
Okay, so we have a question from Joseph here, addressed to anyone who would like to respond. Can you tell us what your understanding at the time was of the opinion in the West regarding what you were doing? Did you believe the West cared?
think that answer is very simple. Yes, the West did care. Charter 77 declaration was immediately published in Western press, and it was followed with a great interest. And maybe the biggest mistake of the Czech communist government was that they didn't know how to react, but they started a public campaign against it, which immediately attracted more and more attention in the West. And solidarity was quite visible. This Committee on the Defense of Charter 77 was created in Paris, I think, 3 weeks later. And from this moment on, we certainly didn't feel that we were lost and alone. By the way, for conservatives here, you can have whatever you want to think about your former presidents. I mean, Jimmy Carter, he made a lot of mistakes in his foreign political strategies, but the fact that he supported international human rights was a great boost for us. And by the way, the fact that Ronald Reagan, who replaced him with different policies, followed the line, was a very interesting continuity in the US foreign policy that otherwise looked very going different directions. So remember that, but international solidarity, not only on the level of interstate system, Helsinki process certainly was a context, on the state of governments, but also on the state of individuals and journalists who started to think about that. And so the West was aware of it, and it was one of the crucial elements that helped us to survive.
Anyone else have a perspective on that question?
I spoke about this for the general audience, but I actually looked up references. There were 5,000 newspaper articles on Charter 77 from 1977 to 2007. So it had a wide readership, mostly in Canada, I think, because there's so many refugees from '68 living around Toronto, Czechs and Slovaks living around. So there was, the people who were interested in it were really interested in it. I think the general public was a little bit, sort of uncertain what it meant.
Yeah. Next question. What was the extent of influence of Western radio broadcast into Czechoslovakia leading up to Charter 77? I was told that even young Slovenians would cross the border into the Czech Republic, into Czechoslovakia, to listen to Western radio broadcasts.
Well, obviously, it was dependent on several factors. One was the intensity of jamming. Was a standard strategy used by the communist government just to make it difficult to listen, especially to Radio Free Europe. I think that one of the impacts of the Helsinki Accords was that Voice of America could not have been jammed as much, because it was this third basket of the Human Rights Conference. We were all listening as much as we can. Some people were much more technically sophisticated than I was, so they had a quite clear that they could listen to Voice of Radio Free Europe too. But obviously the situation was changing. I think that the closer we were to the events of 1989, the better connectivity we had. But it was not only that we were listening these stations, but we were feeding them with our news. It was our channel of communication. So there was a daily practice that people were calling to Medek, who was sitting in Vienna, and others, and immediately reacted from this side. So this was not only, I would say, that we got information from the West, but the West got information from us, and we had some sort of dialogue through these stations. And I don't know whether Slovaks were going to the Czech Republic because there was a better chance to listen to these stations. My guess is that it would be pretty much the same everywhere in Czechoslovakia, and these people most likely were coming for some other reasons. But I think it was mutual. Czechs and Slovaks cooperated in these.
Anyone else with that question? The next question also involves foreign influence. The question is, Russia has recently hacked the Czech MFA and maintains a large number of special operatives in Prague. How worried should we be about an increased Russian influence ahead of the parliamentary elections?
This is actually, this is a question for diplomats of the Czech Republic sitting here. It's not just exactly the part of Chapter 77 discussion, but I would say based on our experience, we should be worried and we should do something about that. And if we don't do something good, it can just this tendency can grow and become more and more dangerous. So no doubt about that. So that I would say we need to be aware that Charter 77 tradition is not liked by all power holders in the world.
Well, I think that that wraps up this session. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. Thank you to the Czech Embassy for hosting this event. We hope to see many of you beginning at noon at Georgetown University. Thank you.